I'm back again. My throat is a little sore, so I might sound very scratchy on this video. But today I'm answering question number 2. How have developments in measurement influenced the work of today's educational and school psychologists? So I first started with a brief overview of the history and development of measures. Measurement instruments are needed in all fields of science to quantify things we observe and prove hypotheses with what is measured. So psychometrics are really important in that because that's like the quantifiable thing that we use to make sure that these measures are actually measuring what we want them to. Psychometrics are used in behavioral and social sciences and is used when measuring psychological singularities. In psychology, mainly questionnaires are used for specific areas of interest that has variables of interest that make up the specific area. For example, in educational psychology, I know I use the mask quite often at my job, and it's used to measure students' levels of anxiety, and it's according to whatever the student answers about themselves on the questionnaire. And it's made up of different factors and theoretical ideas that go into the bigger picture of anxiety. So there's different scales within the one scale that measures general anxiety. So going into the beginnings of measurement, Isaac Newton was thought to be the first to average multiple measures and observations to try to improve accuracy, although he didn't really ever document this in an actual study. He never actually published it. Isaac Newton had little understanding of error in measurement, which is something that school and educational psychologists need to look at when deciding on measures to use. The first recorded use of averaging was in 1660. John Grant used them to summarize birth and death rates in Hampshire, New England. Grant had the thought that there had been connections between birth and death rates, and that these birth and death rates obeyed some law of nature, which the actual emergence of mathematical statistics was not yet until the early 19th century, so he really was ahead of his time at that point. And the growth of astronomy and physics led to the need for more methodical approach to error. So it wasn't until we were trying to get to space and doing all these physics things that we were like, oh, hey, maybe we should start doing error stuff in other things to make sure that things are actually measuring what they're supposed to. These initial comparisons were wrong because there was no distinction between random and systematic error. Fine-tuning and understanding randomness helped to advance the measurements. So that's good. So understanding randomness was what was needed. Sir Francis Galton observed differences of humans to find if intellect was inherited through anatomy. Carl Pearson helped Galton to develop mathematical tools that are still used today to compare variables and the extent to which they're interrelated. Frederick M. Lord wrote the book Statistical Theories of Mental Test. And this book has one of the first definitions of item response theories. And as you know, as school and educational psychologists, we do use item response theories quite a bit when we're doing evaluations with school-age children. Just looking through and making sure that it's basically just going through and making sure that one item that had the same general idea as another item was answered similarly, so that there's no biases and that the administration of it was accurate. Mental illness definitions have grown over the years, and the ability to recognize them has gone from informal observation to more concise approaches. In 1952, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, came out and categorized mental illnesses based on symptoms. This helped to enforce a more organized method of evaluating mental illness. This was the first edition of the DSM in 1952, and it did not include outside factors and when making the list. So they didn't think about environmental factors or other things going on in the child's life that may lead to those symptoms. Not just child, because the DSM is used for, actually as school psychologists we don't even use the DSM, but we do need to know about it since as school psychologists and professionals we need to be able to talk to other psychological professionals who do use the DSM. So we do need to know about it and how it works and some of the history of it, which also goes into testing, because some of these tests get their definitions of what these things are that we're testing from the DSM. So it is good that we know about it. This was progress in the movement towards modern day measurement, but there was still some work to be done. Even the more recent 2000 DSM-4, there was disappointment in the classification structure, and a lot of them just didn't have backings, and it wasn't really supported by research at that point. Even the DSM-5 released in 2013 had time to reclassify categories into scales, but unfortunately it still had some fine-tuning, you could say. Historically, there has been a theory that classification should be on a spectrum rather than sectioned off into black and white categories. The categories have, at the point of the DSM-5, been based on observations of symptoms rather than outside resources, such as genetic markers, internal chemistry, or pathogens. These are the things that I was talking about earlier, kind of like outside sources of maybe why those things are happening. These symptoms are arising. Even though we do not use the DSM often in educational and school psychology field, it is important to understand how it works, because school and educational psychologists work with individuals with autism, ADHD, schizophrenia, and many other mental health categories that are defined in the DSM-5. And I know traditionally, I at least in my understanding of it, we use IDEA more as our definition of things, we will still run across children with different disabilities and mental health categories that are not always going to be outlined in the IDEA sections, at least from my understanding. And the DSM-5 at least categorizes them off so that we can have some sort of idea of what we're looking at, even if we do not agree with all of the cutoffs and things. But I'll go into that later. Anyways, so that's leading into why we test and who develops like certain bases of why we should test. The establishment of IQ tests had led to the development of the definition of intellectual disability, which is something that is categorized in the DSM-5. And it is formally known as mental retardation. This article that I was reading had mental retardation, so excuse me if I say that. I know it's intellectual disability, and it's not correct to say it the other way. Sorry. Having an IQ of 70 or below is one of the requirements for being qualified as educational disability in the DSM-5. The renorming of the IQ test over the years of the IQ test criterion. That's what I'm talking about right now. The criterion that they have to have an IQ of 70 or below is what I'm referring to as like the IQ test criterion. Over the years, changed the percentage of Americans who have an IQ of 70 or less. So the original IQ tests were only normed on whites, and renormed tests included all Americans. So the original tests that they made of IQs were normed on only white people. And then the next edition of it, and I'm talking about the Wechsler, these are like the beginning stages of what we know now as the WISC, but the first section of it was only normed on all whites, and it was a percentage of any percentage of them under 2.27%, like the bottom 2.27% was the cutoff for intellectual disability. And so that was with the first edition. When they came out with the next normed one, they included all Americans and had more diversity, but still kept the 2.27% as the cutoff. And some people think this is wrong because there was huge gains in IQ between the establishment of both these IQ tests. So you would think it would change, but it didn't. They kept it the same, and it was wrong. School psychologists have used the WISC over the last 25 years. School psychologists that have used the WISC over the last 25 years have noticed that the strict criterion for intellectual disability may have become more lenient over time. So they're saying that it's not as strict as it was before. Older tests of the WISC gave inflated scores when compared to the new tests. There was no organized method of gathering the criterion of IQ for the mental or intellectual disability. The gains of intelligence were not actual gains because if it were, those eligible for intellectual disability would have decreased and eventually depleted. This specifically affects school psychologists because students who have presumably been no longer eligible for intellectual disability could have had their labels changed, even though they might still be intellectually disabled. Instead, there was a trade-off between the IQ criterion and the pressures from the parents of those students. The students' acclimation to the label, or a clinical judgment on cases by case basis. So there was like this trade-off. So like yes, the IQ criterion is maybe booting you out of that small percentage of people that have intellectual disability according to the cutoff, 70 or below, 2 standard deviations below the mean. But psychologists and clinicians at the time were just saying like, well, if I think like this individual person, looking at this individual person, I think that they still are, and they've been acclimated to the label. They're used to it. This is what they're used to. This is what they know. We need to keep this label for them because it is helping them. And I think that's a huge part of evaluation and testing for school and educational psychology because like everything's individualized for us. That's like been beat into my head since like the first day of school. It's an IEP, individualized educational plan. Everything is for its own person. You need to look at that singular student and not think of them in a general sense. So that makes sense to me. That trade-off is good. So even though they're not at 70 or below, that they keep the label because it's helping them. Either way, the pattern of IQ score gains has changed the way school psychologists deal with measures of IQ. It makes the school psychologist take into consideration more carefully measure and which addition was given to the student prior to the current evaluation to make good clinical judgments for their individual cases. So it's good that we're considering additions that we're using because now like you shouldn't really even be using an old edition of something if a new one has come out at all. You're given like a year gap to switch to the new edition. And I know it's expensive and that's a whole other thing. But you're supposed to use the new editions of things, and it's because of these IQ gains and differences in IQ. And this is just one of the things that we found in development of measure. Like we didn't know this. People didn't know this when they were first making the measures, but it's good that we kept developing them so that we could figure out that this happens along the line, that there's these gains and, that we need new additions to make things more accurate. Because we're changing populations all the time. Going back to the reason that psychologists use IQ scores as a criterion for intellectual disability, the IQ score criterion is meant to be linked with impaired adaptive behavior. Psychologists have concerns with there being any consistent correlation between the impaired adaptive behavior and an IQ score of 70 or below. Psychologists who had blindly followed this criterion for IQ may have compromised themselves in doing so. The article goes on to explain why the bottom 2.27% of the population was chosen as the cutoff point for intellectual disability. And basically, what was said is Wexler, the person who made the WISC, offered that he had various estimates of mental disability in America, and he estimated that almost 3% of the population had mental deficits. And this justifies the percentage of the bottom 2.27% because it takes into consideration the 0.75% of people that have brain trauma or chromosomal abnormalities. So those are taken out of the bottom 3% that he thought of, and so 2.27% made sense for the bottom of the population to be intellectual disability. The WISC-R introduced the first criterion for mental retardation, which is now known as intellectual disability. Before this, the 2 standard deviations below the mean for the IQ criterion on white Americans and was not inclusive of all Americans. So that's what I was talking about earlier about how they standardized it on just white Americans. Even when the change of population samples for the restandardization of the WISC-R, the cutoff line stayed at any IQ below 70. Some psychologists use tests that are only normed on the same sample at the same time, but this is incorrect practice. These tests may be obsolete, and there may be differing rates of gains on them, which can lead to misdiagnosis. Therefore, it is important as a school psychologist to use the most current form of measures. This article summarizes the hidden history of IQ testing and how that fluctuates. The fluctuation of IQ can cause gains in population IQ. This history is important because restandardization of tests is important to school and educational psychologists. Educational and school psychologists need to be using the most updated versions of testing measures to assure accuracy in testing and for less misdiagnosis. So what I got out of this article mainly is that you need to be using the most updated version of things and make sure that you're checking the psychometrics on every measure that you use, because it's important. And they didn't just develop all this stuff just for nothing, just for you not to read it. You need to be reading these and make sure that you're using accurate and reliable measures in your evaluation so that you don't misdiagnose the student as a school psychologist. And this leads me a little bit into Cronbach, Lee J. Cronbach. He's one of the most influential educational psychologists. He was very smart from a very young age. He got a 200 on the Stanford Binet when he was 5. And he ended up being a participant in a study for intellectually gifted students at that age. Later in his life, let's see. Testing is a big part of what we do as school psychologists, and since the 20th century, school psychologists have been using testing. The information they obtain from testing help to make important decisions for students, such as grade retention or promotion, alternative educational placement, and funding for schools. Testing is very important to educational psychologists, and psychometrics help to analyze these tests. Cronbach improved the mathematics for the psychometrics, and he helped with the understanding of the psychology of test performance. Cronbach reviewed the limitations of the classical psychometric model. He tried to improve the way that psychologists looked at test scores. This led to the reliability theory, a plan for validating test scores, and decision-theoretic approach for basing decisions off test scores. According to Cronbach, only looking at the content of the test can lead to limitations in interpretations of testing data. Cronbach looked at multiple ways that students understood the concepts of a coefficient to interpret how and where students had difficulties. These ideas can be applied to psychology testing as well. So when making a test, you don't just make it one type of question, because some students are going to be good at that type of question and some students are going to be bad at that type of question. So you need to make sure that you're looking at all types of questions to make sure that it can be generalized over multiple students. Cronbach's research on response styles showed how outside factors in testing could affect the interpretations of test results if not given proper interpretation. Consistent answering of test items was also found to be influential to test scores after Cronbach had these ideas to so many other empirical studies came out about measurement. Reliability and later generalizability had a huge impact on educational psychology. His most famous work in reliability is the development of the coefficient alpha. The formula could be used across multiple test measures. It is still popular today amongst educational psychologists. It is rare to find a measure in educational psychology that does not use the Cronbach's alpha. The Cronbach's alpha made it possible to connect the real-world educational psychology into psychometric work, making it easier to interpret testing measures. So he did a lot for our statistical analysis and psychometrics. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about was really just like where the idea for intellectual testing and measures kind of came from. Thorndike, always coming back to Thorndike. Thorndike's contribution to intelligence Thorndike's contributions to intelligence and mental factors based on knowledge. So basically, he thought that he had this theory that there was intellect amongst everyone. Like everybody had this thing of like general knowledge, but everybody was at a separate portion. Like everybody had a different one, depending on how intellectual you are or how knowledgeable you are. And that there were different mental factors that went into that, like memory and psychopathology, not psychopathology, just general knowledge, stuff like that. When Thorndike came up with the idea of intelligence, it was called sampling and was very popular during his lifetime.